Hello, everybody, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we are doing a Knowledge as We See It live. We used to call this our LinkedIn Live. We've recently rebranded it. Today I am joined by the one and only Tia Roberts, the learning and development lead for crew tracking at Delta Airlines. She's years and years of experience in L&D, training pilots, supporting crew members, and using crazy innovative techniques in her ideas, her training content, with a super focus on virtual delivery and instructor-led training, right? ILT in person. So Tia, I'm going to open up with our new favorite line. It's great to hear about knowledge as you see it, here on knowledge as we see it.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we jump in and we get into things, I want to learn a little bit about your background. Can you tell us like where you're from? What did your journey look like? Where did how did you get to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I grew up and I spent most of my life outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And currently I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, just relocating here over the last couple of weeks. And I started with a very high interest in graphic design about 16 years ago. And I'm 100% self-taught, or as I like to call it, went to the University of YouTube. And they have tutorials there for about anything you could want to learn when it comes to the Adobe suites. So I started taking on freelance projects. And then around a few years into that, the company that I was with before Delta, they had a need for a facilitator as well as for external and internal customers. And it kind of just fell into my lap, like so many of us in this field, where we just have this natural gift of wanting to explain how to do things and teach other people and share knowledge. So, like the many of us that just kind of falls into this category, that was me. So, I spent 9 years at that company developing, training, creating relationships with our IT department and things like that. So I started at Delta almost 4 years ago. And when I started, I was in our res department. So I took phone calls just like everybody else to get my foot in the door. Shortly, about a year into that, they had an opening on their learning team. So I put in for that and received that. And about 6 months into the res learning department, I accepted a position for pilot learning and development. So I spent 2 years there doing a lot of compliance training for our pilots. And then I just recently moved over to our crew tracking department.
Wow, that is quite the truth. Is as reading from our comments here, we went to University of YouTube, right? We're big fans of self-learning, right? There's so much that you can do just to grow yourself from the free resources that you even have,
So
online today.
Well, and it's funny because I have a degree in business management, but I feel like so many of us, when we would pick out what we're going to go to school for, we don't always end up using it. Like we try to pick like safe majors and what we think we might do, but our career tends to kind of take us in its own path. And it's not always feasible to return back to school.
So, one of the things we love to ask all of our guests is what is the best career advice you've ever received?
So I've actually received the same advice from many of my favorite leaders, and that is I am not alone. So it is so important to network, build relationships, and cultivate a lifestyle where you can reach out to so many people, never burn bridges, because I can't tell you how many times just in the last 2.5 weeks in my new role that I've reached out to experts in analytics that I've made connections with and experts in onboarding and things, sharing knowledge. So definitely it's building that professional network and making those connections.
That's absolutely true. I cannot think of anything, but I think the people I've met across my career, whether they're in New York or in Israel or in California or in London, it's all been kind of like that's how I found myself growing, is just taking that knowledge from all these different places. And I like to say we're a culmination of our experiences.
That is so
and it,
true.
and it's kind of like that's when the more people we network, the more we learn from them, the more we're able to bring that into our like everyday lives. It's incredible.
And it really makes your own job easier. You're never going to be an expert in everything. So share your knowledge and let others share their knowledge with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're going to do a bit of a fun one here, but you kind of already told us in our pre-recording a little bit of something fun about you. I'm going to ask you to share that with our crowd today.
Well, I actually had a different fun fact I was going to share. It's similar, but and that is that I am an extreme craftaholic. And so anytime I pick up a new hobby, I actually have to like push it to the professional level. So I've made like pageant dresses for my daughter. I've made costumes that have been televised. I competed in LA that so the host was like Kenan Thompson, and it was Martha Stewart was one of the judges, and so it was like an amazing experience. And then like I have laser engravers, and like so anything that I pick up as a hobby, like I have to like push to the next level. I print custom fabric and all kinds of crazy things.
Sure, that's something I think we all do. Have custom fabric printed in our houses. Did you see the show? I think it was Nick Offerman and well, she played Leslie Nope. I'm blanking on her name. They have kind of their whole like crafty show. They had a show, it was like one season where they, kind of came together and did it like all at home, but your grade. Like the people who took it to that next level and did a whole show on just like getting crafty.
I have not, but I've definitely watched like Nailed It, and I'm a terrible
Yeah.
cook, like an awful cook. So I would like fit in right into that show, but I often thought like they should do like a really like competitive craft show, but I'll have to look that up.
Oh no, I'll get it to you. Amy Poehler. Thank you, Brittany Davis. That is I am so embarrassed that I forgot that, but I'm at least happy I knew who Leslie Nope was. So, Tia, let's jump in. We have a whole bunch of people with us today. Let's jump into our main topic. So, in your opinion, we've seen a lot of people, especially over the last few years, bring video and visual communication into the learning and development and into kind of ID. But how has that kind of revolutionized the way people are engaging with what we call corporate knowledge?
So we live in this age where information is constantly at our fingertips, it's in our faces. We have screens, TVs, computers, phones, iPads that everybody has in their pocket nowadays. And so you buy a piece of furniture and the instructions aren't instructions anymore. It's a QR code that takes you to a YouTube video of how to put that furniture together. I mean, even the pandemic really made a huge push where restaurants now have the QR codes on their tables for everybody to pull up on their phone. Paper saver, yes, but so that's what that does, though, as an industry in the whole, is it makes it so much more challenging to fight for that engagement because they're so used to the extreme stimulus of having those, apps and entertainment in their face all the time. So, from a corporate and L&D standpoint, we have to work so much harder to create that engagement because there's already this I'm bored so quick that we have to like get over that hurdle to get them to actually retain that information that we're trying to teach them.
So you're talking about information retention, knowledge retention. When we're talking about that, particularly in the world of health, safety, emergency protocols, I mean, that must be a huge priority for you at Delta.
Well, it's a priority for, I think, every major corporate. I mean, any business. I mean, safety should be number one always. It definitely is here at Delta. But I think that safety lessons can also become routine. And so, in what I like to call wallpaper, because you have to take it every year and you start like anticipating and ignoring and just clicking through as fast as possible because it's something that you have to take, that compliance piece. But safety really is something that we need to take much more care to making sure that we're delivering that message and that they're going to be able to use it in an emergency. So one of the things that I think is really important to do is to incorporate humor in it. So studies have definitely shown that there's a high correlation in retention and humor. And Delta came out with a series of onboard safety videos a while back where they like took generations and brought them in, so they were like carrying like boom boxes on board the flights and stuff, and they were like, oh, we have to stow this under the seat if it doesn't. I mean, it was very, very funny. They're on YouTube, you can look them up. And then most recently, I think Alaskan Air did one during the pandemic with the masks, and all of their flight attendants were dancing, and it made like national news. So anytime that you can kind of incorporate like humor in that, it's still a very sensitive subject that you need to make them remember, but they're going to remember. It's going to make that lasting impression wherever you can kind of implement that.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of seeing that all over, specifically in the airline industry. It's almost like leading the way because safety, specifically in airlines, it's almost you have your frequent flyers who are like, I've seen this safety and training video 1,001 times, but then you have those new flyers who everything is kind of brand new for, and it kind of pulls them in. And even if you change up that, I don't know what the video is called, in the parlance of the flight industry, but that first video, the where right before you take off, they show the video. If an event of an emergency, air is going to fall down. Right,
so
and
Delta
even
is
for the
really
frequent
good.
flyers.
So that's a different department than what I am in, but I do fly a lot. And I will say, I'd say every two flights, so every month to month and a half, I see a different version of the video. So, and I can't help but not watch. So it definitely does its job with that, like catches my attention because I'm like, that's a different person than the last time. Oh, they're not wearing masks this time, or like, so they do a really good job of keeping it fresh and adding in different people. And sometimes they'll even like add a little when the Olympics were going on. They kind of did a little bit of sprinkling of that into the video and things like that. So they try to prevent that wallpaper effect.
Yeah, no, I think when I was in the U.S., I used to fly Delta was my primary airline when I was
Love to hear
flying for
that.
work. Well, I did a lot of flying back and forth from Atlanta and California, and Delta was pretty much the only airline I flew. But you did notice, right? There were multiple versions of the video, and it depended the plane you were on, who was on the route on that specific day. But they you guys, kind of moved it around enough that frequent
Keep it
flyers
fresh.
still get pulled in. Yeah. So obviously you've been doing this for a while, and can you kind of give us a bit of an example of how you've successfully rolled out visual storytelling when it comes to training your pilots? And I know you can't get into details there, but and crew members as well.
So I think one of the best examples was actually when I worked in the res department, and we were doing a train the trainer session. So all the new facilitators were coming in, and we were kind of just going over like best practices. And one of the things that was in a previous version of the training was like a list of don'ts, like the most common facilitation errors. And I looked at this list, and I feel like, especially in learning, like people tend to gravitate towards lists, but you're not really going to remember a lot of lists watching 30 seconds and then having to implement that later on, right? So what I did instead of a list was I took the most common facilitation errors and I actually made a cartoon version of a blooper reel, and I had animated facilitators performing these acts, like chewing gum while trying to teach, or talking with your back towards the audience, and things that leaving your mic on if the class was virtual during a break, like things like that that you may not think of, but it kind of like puts doubts in their mind. Of the class and the content and things like that. So trying to put your best foot forward all the time. And so after they watched this animated version, then of course it got a lot of laughs and chuckles. And at the end, they had to tell us what were the errors or, actual action items that those facilitators did wrong. And then we went into, okay, so have you ever had a facilitator actually do those things in your class? You don't have to name names, right? And so of course almost everybody raised their hand. And how did that make you feel? What kind of doubts did that put in your mind? And so the next time that they reached for those Cheeto bags because they skipped lunch while they were teaching, they're going to think twice because they're going to remember, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to be the one everybody's laughing at, or that they remember in their class, like, yeah, she was talking with her mouth full and everything. So it's ways that you can kind of really resonate and pull that visual connection with them.
Yeah, and I think I like to pull stories from my own life whenever we whenever we do things like this. But when I got engaged, so my wife and I met. Obviously, we're overseas, and so we met. We're going back to Canada to go meet her friends, go meet her family, and right. So what do I get? That whole list of these are all my friends in Canada, and these are the people whose names you need to remember. I particularly, and my team mocks me for this nonstop. I struggle to remember names. Faces, I'm great with. Names, terrible. And so my wife actually sat and drew me out little maps of which friends are friends with whom, because it gave me that little bit of context. Now it happens to be
Yeah.
my wife works in instructional design, so she kind of knows the tips and tricks. But she was giving me what I call contextual knowledge. Right? I'm not going to remember those tiny little details, but if you give me the right context in the moment, I'll go, oh,
I remember
that's Mary.
that.
That's Marianne. Okay, Marianne is friends with Kate, and Kate is friends with Julia. Okay, now I know that those three are together in a group, and likely if those are the three who are together, these are the people I'm speaking to. Right?
Yes.
Especially when you're meeting, 150 new people in the span of 12 hours. So I think it also makes sense to do the same thing when you're, talking about how do we do habit changing behavior, right? How do we
Yes,
change those bad
absolutely.
habits, right? Let's give them the context to understand why.
Exactly. Exactly.
So can you talk about how technology is kind of starting to play a role as you're doing storytelling and kind of the impact it's having for you in your instructional design?
Um, I mean, there's lots of different technology avenues, right? I mean, you have the technology for the platforms to actually build the learnings, but then you also have to consider all the technology that's out there that could be delivering the content. Not everybody is on computers anymore, so sometimes they're taking it from iPads and they're taking it from cell phones. They're not just taking it from cubicles anymore. Sometimes they're on the job in a warehouse, in a hangar, performing, mechanical things, and they have to take a compliance training in between their job, their assignments, right? So you have to keep in mind not just who your audience is anymore, but the method that your lesson is actually going to be delivered to them and what is best for them when doing that. So if you know that they're going to be taking lessons from a cell phone, then you have to kind of rethink like drag and drop interactions because it's going to be much difficult. You still want to keep those interactions and touch points and that pull in that engagement, but you have to be a little more creative about it, depending on technology that they're going to be using.
Yeah, no, I get that. So you kind of talked about some of the challenges you have to overcome, right? As we're moving into, let's call it multi-generational learning, right?
Yes.
We're in kind of this unique period right now where we have Gen Z, millennial, and boomer all in the workforce at the same time. And for instructional designers, this presents a particularly unique challenge because you're not necessarily going to build the same learning material three times in three different ways for your three different generational audiences. How do you kind of overcome that challenge?
I think in even in the lessons that I've just been doing the last couple of weeks, it's trying to appeal to multiple audiences in once. So when doing some kind of like animated video or video at all, making sure that they have like the closed caption option available to them. Just because not everybody wants to listen to it. Some people are multitaskers that they'll have something else playing or they just can't because they're taking phone calls. So you need to have options for them. And then also, what I've been doing is like highlights at the end that's available to them in like a PDF format so that yes, they've taken this training. I don't expect them to have everything memorized in the training, right? Because they're not going to. But my hope is that they're like, I remember this was part of the training. And then they can go back and they can pull those highlights for them to refresh or to look in more detail. That was mentioned, but I can't quite remember. So it's trying to appeal to all the different types of learner, have them, watch something and hear something, and then give them something tangible that they can keep in the end.
No, that makes 100% sense. So I'm actually going to jump into the comments for a second because there was one that was really interesting to me. We had one of our learning and development leaders here said, I work with health equity topics, and she struggles. We were talking a bit before about humor. She struggles to incorporate humor when discussing topics related to inequities, right? So if you're using humor as that tool, how do you do that in a way that's still appropriate or develop something else that's going to engage?
So all I can say is obviously I don't know the exact content that she is specifically building, but sometimes I have to look at the content as a whole and take a deep breath and just kind of like, how can I make this interesting? And I think one of the really good examples is something I'm actually working on right now to try to get out by the end of this week is we have a bunch of rule changes going into effect with new contracts that have come down the line. And it's going to affect the new department that I'm working with. And so a lot of it doesn't go into effect until later, but some of it is going to affect them immediately. And as I'm reading these rules, I mean, think contract jargon, right? And it's incredibly boring and it's very technical. And so you're going through this. But what I realized is for this specific thing that I'm working on, I had about 10 different items that I needed to cover to let them know as soon as possible. And then I'm going to work on the part two. But as I'm looking and I'm reading, I realize this content is very quick. It's like 2 sentences a piece, right? So I'm like, how is some ways that as a society we deliver very quick content like this? And what I connected with was top 10 videos that you see on like Extra and I can't even like ESPN, and they'll do like the top 10 like plays of the week and things like that. So I'm like, that's perfect because only a couple sentences each. So then just taking that content, finding the right kind of music that goes into it in the background real low, watch how other professionals do it, like ESPN, and then try to pull in those elements. So sometimes it doesn't always necessarily be funny, but it's some way of connecting to the entertainment industry as well and how they present information. Because when you look at things, people struggle to remember lessons that we deliver, but they can go to the movies, watch it for the first time, and quote an entire scene play by play for somebody. So why is that, and how can we tap into that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it actually parlays perfectly. One of the things that I think when we speak with people who work in instructional design or corporate training or learning, or however you want to call it, we're constantly having conversation with them about the effectiveness, right? So we talk a lot about engagement, and the reason that engagement has kind of become such a big hot button topic is really because higher engagement leads to higher impact, right? That's the whole reason for it. How do you actually go about measuring that outside of my NPS score or my, quick, I took a course, now I took a quiz immediately right after the course. Thank you, forgetting curve. So I'm still within my forgetting curve. I get my quick, answered more than 8 out of 10 on the quiz correct. Check. This has been passed. How do we actually measure kind of the long-term impact of our learning?
I think because learners are not afraid to tell you what they think about your training, good and the bad. So a lot of that is surveys that we give them. And most of the time, in my experience, they are pretty candid about, I couldn't keep my eyes open during this, or the complete opposite of, wow, this really connected the concept for me. And then as well as talking to the managers, their supervisors directly, are they still seeing trends of a behavior that training was meant to correct, or maybe an entire training and one element of it is constantly being missed by the audience. So that needs to be more fleshed out. So it's definitely that Addy model where you're doing that evaluation piece after the training and really trying to listen to not only the learners but their direct supervisors who are seeing exactly how they're performing and then adjusting to accommodate.
That makes sense. So if I'm an instructional designer, right, and obviously I'm, let's say I'm coming from an organization that's still kind of paper inside a binder here. Here's your workplace safety training manual. Please sign here to say that you've read it, the day I hand it over, so that
Yes.
at least on a compliance perspective, we can knock it off. And, I go to my learning team lead and I say, hey, we need to start incorporating some visual design in. What are kind of the first steps that you would tell them to take to kind of sell this through to their leadership above to bring in the tools you're going to need to incorporate, that visual storytelling?
It depends on the situation. If I have the opportunity to actually view the current training as it's being presented, I really like to just sit in and watch, because I'm not only watching the facilitator, I'm watching that audience to see when they're exactly lost or when they're not, if they're not engaged or if they are engaged, and then kind of taking notes on certain topics where we're maybe losing them that might need to be presented differently. But then you kind of just have to evaluate and analyze the actual learning itself, like the content, and read through that, and then look for opportunities as well, like we were talking before with like those listed items, and coming up with maybe a different alternative way to present that. And then as well, if there's any like hands-on software teaching or anything where you can do kind of like software simulations instead, and breaking up training as much as possible, because nobody wants to sit there and be lectured for 2 hours, but really no learning for instructor-led should be a lecture. It should be conversational. But still, nobody wants to have a conversation for 8 hours, right? So you have to break that up to different, not just give them, a restroom break, but videos and evaluations and e-learnings, and really divide up their time a little bit, and better uses, because as much as like PowerPoints are great, they're not the best delivery method for software simulation. Maybe for a high level overview of something that's coming, but really when you want them to start using a certain platform, or they need that practical hands-on experience to really feel comfortable, like they have been given the skills to be successful.
We have a segment that I call Mailbag, right? And this is where I'm going to throw it out to our audience on LinkedIn. If you have questions, throw them in the comments. I'm looking through a few of our comments as we go through. We kind of already addressed one of them. There's a comment here that I'd love kind of your viewpoint on. And one of them said, it's from our friend Fred, said relationships mean everything, right? And that's kind of hard to hold that personal relationship when, see, you're responsible for training how many people?
Currently 60, but my last role 15,000.
Right. How are you going to maintain a relationship when you're responsible for training 15,000 people? How do you at least give the feeling of that relationship?
I think that pulls back towards the entertainment, because how do movies do it? They pull into key experiences that societies and groups of people as a whole have. You pay attention to relevant, popular events that are going on, and you try to incorporate certain things into the training as well. Connect with what's going on in their job roles, what's going on maybe in their specific cities, depending on how your training programs are laid out. Things that are relevant to them in the now, just like, documentaries do. And you walk out, crying. You don't even know that person. Why? Why are you crying? Because you can feel the way that they feel, right? So, and that kind of also, you have to use by example. So something that they strongly do in entertainment to connect with people is through music. I don't think enough people use it in e-learnings. and I don't want to overuse it, but there's definitely a time and a place for those like sound effects and those music to set tones to certain training to have those connection with your audience.
So I have one here that's interesting. So one of the people in the comments compared storytelling to scenario based training. How would you, or is there, obviously there are similarities, but are they always the same thing?
I don't think they're always the same thing. I definitely think there's a lot of overlap because in a really good scenario, you're going to be telling a story. But not every scenario based training where you're giving them examples and then having them like work through the problem like you would with a scenario. You could just be, it could be a warning like a wives tale or a fable like that, so you're still using storytelling to teach, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that there's action that's involved like a scenario based learning would be.
There's a little bit of a conversation going on around music. Guys, Tia is secretly super musical. Um, I'm outing her. That's it. So I don't know if you've watched, there's a documentary called Score that I'm kind of obsessed with. Okay, it essentially talks about the role that music plays in the cinema universe. Okay, and how and the music design that goes into cinematic masterpieces, right? How does music play a role in Harry Potter, The Rock, Armageddon, and talking about using music to kind of almost subconsciously tell people, hey, something exciting or nerve wracking or is going to happen. How do you kind of use music to give people that feeling during an instructional video?
So a perfect example is the top 10 contract changes that I'm working on.
Yep.
I have music low is the key. Watch how the professionals do it. It's in the background so that it's keeping you riveting until that next point, right? It's keeping you engaged. But in the same sense, you could look at a lot of YouTube tutorials. One of my favorite guys out there is bringyourownlaptop.com. He does a little intro to every single tutorial. It's like maybe 5 seconds, but it's super catchy and grabs your attention. And it's like, oh, I know that he's going to tell me what the next topic is. Because they're like micro lessons
Right.
on different things. And so using it as like a key of that's the next topic, or that is something I need to pay attention to or like point out. And so it's kind of similar to like sound effects. So like you got it right sound effect and try again sound effects, and maybe even after that whole like that you get so excited because you just like congratulations, yay, you like. So there are definitely overlaps from sound effects to music. And somber, we've had lessons where the tone is incredibly serious because we're educating about maybe something that has happened in the past. And you can still use music when you're storytelling that kind of sets that tone right then and there. Like, this is serious and we need to, because humor is great, but it's also flexing it up and down because everything can't constantly be funny. But everything shouldn't always be serious either. So it's using that, engaging with the content that you're delivering of what kind of tone does this need to be set for this.
That totally makes sense. So there's one comment here that I'd love for you to respond to. It's PowerPoint sounds so old fashioned these days. Now, I don't know if PowerPoint is completely dead in the world of instructional design. I know it's had its moment, but what is the appropriate time to jump into a slideshow versus more video based or interactive based?
So I think that PowerPoint depends on how you use it. It's not meant to put books on the screen, like just waterfall walls of text. Like, that's not what it's meant to use for. It's supposed to be highlights only. So it can be a very effective tool for instructor led portions. But again, you have to highlight the importance. It shouldn't be every sentence that the instructor is saying, right? It's meant to maybe flesh out things. You want to remember this. You want to remember it all, but this may be on the test.
Right. Remember this part? This is the part you write down. You're writing down in your little notebook because it's
And
gonna
we
come up later.
still, and like we were talking about before, appealing to different learning styles, because if it's nothing but audio, nothing but somebody talking, that can get mundane as well. And then people stop, they lose focus. So having like PowerPoint up on the screen to pull out those key factors, it also helps the learner know, like, I should probably write that down. If they wrote it down, I should probably write it down.
So I'm also reading this here in one of those, I like the idea that not everything can be serious, but how do you find that balance? Like, let's say we're doing a workplace safety video, right? There's an element of we don't want it to be too humorous because we don't want people to think that workplace safety is a joke, but, right? So how do we kind of strike that balance?
So I definitely think there is a place to have group communication, especially with leadership and stakeholders when it comes to that. Um, and that's about that balance, right? Like serious, little joke, serious, happy thoughts, serious. And it's that flexibility also helps keep engagement, right? So when it's the same tone, it's like listening to the teacher from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Like very monotone and you lose that engagement. So it's important to kind of try to keep that flow, that structure that keeps engagement. But when it comes to, I mean, there have been times definitely where I've thrown out an idea, like a first idea that, a couple of us had or I had, and the response from leadership was like, I like where you're going with this, but here's where I'm afraid of. I'm like, yeah, I was worried about that too. But sometimes that first idea that's maybe too much could actually spring and help you develop other ideas that are a better fit for those situations. So I think collaborative is almost the way to go, bouncing off of other people that are, leadership within that department or stakeholders of that knowledge and getting their input on how far is too far.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Tia, I know our time is coming to a close. Thank you so much for joining us on Knowledge Live. First of all, your experience is amazing, and we loved hearing about it. It's like it's no wonder you're flying super high, right? Great pun. I'm really proud of it. No, seriously, you're really helped us all understand how we can enhance our learning and development programs, how we can incorporate more into the flow of work, and really pull people in. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, it
We
was my
really appreciate it.
pleasure. I'm so happy to be here and share my point of view. I'm always willing to talk.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.